welcome to A Day in the Life. This is the 98th program in our series, but it is in fact only the second time that we've ever done this virtually. For the first 96 programs, we were live in front of an audience at the Midland Cultural Center, but for the last couple of programs, we have been doing this on a Zoom platform and broadcasting to you on the Rogers website and Rogers Live and on the Midland Cultural Center website. We want to thank our sponsors who make this program possible. Our season sponsors are Kathy Bales and Michelle Dishaw of RBC Dominion Securities. And our show sponsor for this show are the Honorable Robert McKinnon and Mrs. Sharon McKinnon. So our gratitude to them for making the program possible. I am thrilled, I am honored to introduce to you the 17th Chief Justice of Canada, the first female to serve in that role, the longest serving Chief Justice in Canada's history. Please welcome Madam Justice Beverly McLachlin. Hello.
Thank you. Hi, nice to be here.
Thank you for joining us, Your Honor. You have had a fascinating life, and we have an hour to have this conversation, and I have no idea how we're going to cover the many facets of your life, but I will tell you that I was fascinated in reading your autobiography, Truth Be Told, by the influences of your early life. And because this program likes to focus on the inspirations that have led people to where they are in their successful lives, I want to talk a little bit about your early days. You spent a lot of your early days moving around. You moved about 4 times in the first few years, and you were on a ranch and on a farm. And during that time, you were often fairly isolated. What was the impact of that isolation in your youth?
Yeah, well, my father tended to like to live in solitary places. So that's where his family went with him. And sometimes there was a period when we were quite close to the little town of Pincher Creek, where I was born and which was the nearest place to where I grew up. But other times, more often, we settled on a ranch when I was about 11, which was 25 miles outside the town. And we were very much alone. I mean, there were lots of trips into town, and we felt part of the community. But at the same time, we were there more or less alone on the ranch. What impact did that have? I think it makes one a little more introspective, perhaps, and thoughtful, and there was a lot of time to think about things and to wonder about things. Also, we were very close to nature. We lived in a very beautiful place, and there wasn't a day when I didn't feel really, really privileged to live where we lived. So I developed a deep appreciation of the importance of being in a lovely place and how blessed that is in one's life.
Pincher Creek has played a big part in your development. I was fascinated to learn that when you chose a picture for your office at the Supreme Court, it was a picture of the road leading to Pincher Creek. And you made a comment in your book. You said, the people who lived in and around Pincher Creek were a diverse lot. What did you mean by that?
Well, they were diverse. The basic stock of the community were Brits, people like remittance men and early ranchers who came out from England. And so it had that very British Empire feel about it. But then in the 30s, 20s and 30s, there was an influx of a lot of other people. There were people from Quebec who had French names, and there were people from Mennonites, there were Hutterites, there were quite a few diverse communities that ended up settling there and overlaying the Anglo kind of culture. And in addition, there were Indigenous people at the Bicani Reserve, which is just 9 miles from Pincher Creek, was one of the 3 Blackfoot nations. So that was also a very much a part of the community, although in those days there was almost de facto segregation, and they had their community and we had ours. But I grew up very aware that there were lots of different kinds of people in the world, and even in our little community. I mean, there was the Chinese person who ran the only restaurant in town, and so there were lots of different kinds of people to think about.
You had an experience when the students from that Indian community, the First Nations community, came to high school. You made a good friend named Peter Yellowhorn, and you speak about him and his aspirations in your book. And he ended up being a significant chief, did he not?
He did. But, you know, the thing that strikes me ironically as an irony is that, you know, I remember asking Peter, he sat right across the aisle from me in our grade 12 class, and I said, we would discuss what we were going to do. And he said, well, I'm going to go to university, and I'm going to be a lawyer. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Who would ever want to be a lawyer? I never dreamed that I would become a lawyer. Ultimately, he wasn't able to realize that dream because at that time, in order to get to the university, you had to have a foreign language, which was either German, French, or Latin. And the only one that was offered at our school was French. And Peter, although he had two very good languages, Piikani and English, could not master French, and he never was able to get to university. So that was an early lesson in how one can have unintentional discrimination just by setting standards in a way that thoughtlessly exclude others.
You mentioned in your book that you had a bit of an impact because of your family's German heritage. You said, and I quote, young as I was, I understood what it meant to be the same yet different, to be equal yet on probation. I thought that was very profound.
Well, it is true. I mean, it's hard to describe, but it gave me a feel for what minority people in Canada must feel, and newcomers to Canada must feel. They feel not quite, maybe they don't feel discriminated against in any active sense, but they in somewhere deep inside, they feel they don't quite belong, that they're going to have to try a little harder, that people are looking at them a little more closely.
I was interested in your comment in the book that from a very early age, you said, all I knew was that I wanted to be something that wasn't ordinary. What an intriguing thought for a young person to have.
Yeah, I don't know why that was, and actually I didn't articulate it at the time, but I always had this sense that I wanted to have an interesting, diverse life and explore other things. And wasn't so much as an ego trip that I have to be exceptional or anything like that, but I wanted to, much as I loved the community I grew up on and so on, I was a very curious about other things, and I wanted to have some sort of a future that would be different, perhaps, than that my parents had experienced.
Something that interested me about your early education was the role that the Pincher Creek Municipal Library played in your education. And again, I quote from the book, you said, it saved me from premature intellectual death. That's a pretty big statement.
Yeah, that might be a slight exaggeration. I don't know what would have happened otherwise, but it really was unbelievably enriching because through this library, I was able to take out a couple of books a week. And after I did the juvenile section, I got into the adult section, and I really was able to explore history because I loved historical novels. I was able to explore other parts of the world, other parts of Canada. And so it took me on trips. In those days, we didn't have television, so to be able to read and enter by my imagination through books, those different worlds was amazing. And it also taught me a lot. I mean, along the way, you pick up a lot of vocabulary, you get you develop your reading skills and comprehension and so on. So I've always believed that reading saved me in some very important way from intellectual death, if you want to put it that way.
And yet, when you were finishing public school, your teacher said to you, you have an extremely high reading retention score, but that won't do you much good as a girl, you know.
Yeah, well, girls could be housewives, and that was the default position. Even if you had some sort of career, that's what was usually going to happen in the expectation. And you would not work outside the home any longer. Careers were temporary things that lasted for a few years in your youth. And if you chose a career, then it was going to be teaching or nursing or secretarial services and a few other jobs that were available to women. And so they were looking for those jobs when they were trying to advise me as to what I could do, and a high reading retention score didn't seem to be very useful. I also had a very low alertness score, so the teacher who was advising me said, I don't know what to tell you, but I can tell you this: you should never be a waitress or a telephone operator. So I was saved from those careers.
You put that to heart.
And I would have been terrible at those jobs.
You tell a story about one of your public school teachers much later in your life, after you had achieved certainly some fame and notoriety in this country, apologizing to you. And that was a touching story.
Yeah, when I went back in 2006 for the 100th anniversary of my little town, and there was a bit of a reception and a line, and it was quite an affair, actually. It was just a beautiful affair. And many of the townspeople and people I had known in my youth came by to say hello. And this one teacher, still very elegant, and now she must have been at least 90. And she came by and she sort of offered an apology. She said, she's speaking of my brothers and myself, and she said, we didn't know much about teaching in those days. She said, we didn't realize what to do with really bright people, and how gifted you and your brothers were. And I sort of felt badly for her. I thought she's carried this burden all her days. I said, don't worry, you gave us a good education. And they did. I mean, in those days, in that little town, for public school anyway, they weren't looking to necessarily inspire. They were looking to teach 30 or 35 kids the basics. So here it is, get on with it, learn it. The rest of your life is going to be up to you. And that's the way it was. They didn't think a lot about those things. Most of those teachers hadn't really had that much training either. They'd been to normal school, as it was called then. It was some sort of teacher's training after high school. And so, you know, the richness of the educational experience that is afforded to teachers today wasn't there for them. But they did a good job on the whole.
You went on to secondary school and had to room. You lived in a dorm then, and then you went off to university, pursuing a BA against the advice of your parents, as I understand it.
Well, they thought, and this goes back to the mindset that I described a moment ago. I mean, they thought, well, what good is a BA going to do? And every time I came home from holidays, it was like, what are you going to do with that? You have all these books, you're studying literature and philosophy and languages, and how are you going to earn a living with that? I mean, for most people in my parents' position, certainly them, the purpose of education was to put you in a position where you could earn a living, and it still is. But I just felt somehow that I needed to explore all these things, and that out of it something would come where I could get by.
So you graduated from the University of Alberta with a Bachelor of Arts in philosophy, and then you decided that you would do graduate work, pursue a master's in philosophy, and you quoted yourself as saying, "My path in life was set. I would be a professor of philosophy." That changed, and then changed in part because of a fascinating person in your life, Rory McLachlin, not coincidentally the same surname as yours. And you said in the book, "Rory became a presence that weaved in and out of my life for 40 years, giving it color and strength and heft. And he really played a significant role in your decision to go into law." Can you tell us about that?
Well, yes, this was, we were just friends at this point, but he was actually going to university mostly in the East, but he was thinking about coming to the University of Alberta to study where I was, and I was in this final summer, and I was sort of dithering, what should I do? And he said, "Well, why don't you go into law? I think you would be a good lawyer." And he knew me quite well, and he knew what I could do and what I wasn't so good at, and so I took the advice seriously. But I not as seriously perhaps as I should. But toward the end of the summer, I was thinking about his advice, and I wrote from Pincher Creek to the Dean of Law at the University of Alberta. And I said, "Could you send me some information about the study of law?" And I thought I'd get back a big package. And instead I got, within 4 days, a very slim envelope, and I opened it up. And the Dean Bowker, had written me a letter, and he said, "Thank you for your inquiry. You are admitted to the Faculty of Law. Classes begin." And I just about dropped the letter. I mean, I was so amazed, and I think I'm probably the only person in Canada who ever got admitted to a Faculty of Law without applying. But that changed my life. I decided I'd give it a try, and I was in the law ever since.
And you did remarkably well at law school. You were the gold medalist as the top student, but not the editor-in-chief of the Law Review. And I thought those two things pretty much went together.
Yeah, I did too, but I remember feeling disappointed and slightly upset when one of my classmates, male, the announcement was that he would be the editor-in-chief, and I would get the next position, which was Notes position. And I thought, well, obviously the faculty had got together and they had discussed it, and they thought that he would do a better job than I did. But I really wondered whether the fact that I was a woman had something to do with it.
It was a different era then.
It was.
You and I went to law school at about the same time, and there weren't females in my class. So
no. We were anomalies, and we were unknown quantities, and not to be entirely trusted.
You were called to the bar in Alberta in '69, and you practiced with an Edmonton firm in litigation, and then you moved to BC and called to the bar in BC in '71. Relocated, you were in Fort St. John, relocated to Vancouver in '72, and then fairly shortly thereafter did become a professor, but not a professor of philosophy. Tell us about that decision.
Yeah, well, I practiced law for a few years, and I was really enjoying it. And then, but for some reason, I started thinking about teaching again. And at that, they always had, and I think still have, a number of lawyers who go to the law school, UBC, and give classes in the more practical subjects. So I thought, oh, I'll give a class I'll take on a class in civil litigation, see how I like it. So the dean said, fine, you can teach this class, which I did, and I really liked it, and I had a great time with the students, and so I thought about this, and I thought maybe for a few years in my life I'll see how it feels to be a teacher of law. Now, I was always attracted to the theoretical aspects of law as well as practical, and teaching would give me an opportunity to explore some of that. So I signed up as an associate professor with tenure at UBC, and I was there for 7 years.
And then you got the first.
Before I was asked to go on the bench.
Right. I was going to say you got the first of many phone calls in your career. Yes. And you were quite young. And I think the arithmetic works out to that you were 37 when you were invited to go on the bench.
Yes.
Your Honor, that's faster than some cases move through the courts.
Well, when I went to the Supreme Court of Canada, I was 47, and the treasurer of the Law Society of British Columbia, who came to the ceremony where I was inducted, made the quip that I had moved through the court system faster than most cases, which brought the house down. But it was true that often cases took longer than 10 years, and I had gone from being a county court judge to the Supreme Court of Canada in 10 years, much to my amazement.
And moving very quickly, because you only spent 5 months at the county court level. You then went to the Supreme Court of British Columbia, and within 7 years were the Chief Justice there. And within 6 months, I believe, were appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada. That process probably isn't one that's familiar to many of those who are viewing. How does one get to be a judge?
Well, now it's different than it was then. Then it was the tap on the shoulder method, and you were known by lawyers and judges, and thought, well, possibly that's a person who could be a judge. So at the time, the government of Canada, it was the days of John Turner and Pierre Trudeau, and they were really pushing to get more women on the bench. There were just about no women on the bench, 1 or 2 here and there. And so they were looking for women who had the 10 years that was required for the federally appointed courts, and I was one of the few who was available, so obviously they looked at me. And I had worked with the then Chief Justice Alan Mclaughlin on a few files, and I had worked with some leading lawyers who obviously must have thought that I could do the job, so my name went forward and I was asked, and then I decided to accept that. And nowadays, though, it's different. As everyone knows, people apply to go on the bench.
That must have been a difficult decision for you, because it came at a very tragic time of your life that you were invited to join the Supreme Court of Canada. Your husband, Rory, had just passed away. You had a 12-year-old son as a single parent. And I'm interested in the role he played in your decision.
Yes, well, we had decided to take a vacation in Australia in April, or rather, yes, it was the beginning of April, and we were at Townsville, which was near the Barrier Reef, where Angus, who loved nature, still does, wanted to go diving on the Barrier Reef. And I got this call from the minister's office, and they had finally located me. It wasn't easy. And I told him what the call was about. It was you're being considered for this, and if you were asked, would you accept? And I didn't know. And he said, I'll call you back tomorrow morning. So I had a conversation with Angus that night, and I said this was what the call was, and I said, I don't think it's the right time for us to go to Ottawa, Supreme Court of Canada. You've just lost your father, I've made a change in my job. I took on this big job of being the Chief Justice of the Trial Division. And I said, now we'd have to move and you'd have to go to a different school and make different friends. And I don't think it's the right time. That was fine. He went to bed. And then in the morning, he came out of his room and he said to me, I think you should do it. You should do it. And he was 12 years old, but he was very definite about it. No ifs, buts, or maybes. That was it. He thought about it and that was the decision. And so I did it. And I told Brian Mulrooney that I would accept the position.
When you arrived in Ottawa at your swearing-in ceremony, Bertha Wilson whispered something that I think was a classic comment. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, she was wonderful. She whispered in her Scottish brogue, 3 down and 6 to go. And it was, it didn't carry, I don't think, over the courtroom, but it certainly carried to me and to the judges on the bench. And I laughed. Obviously, we were 9 judges, and I became the 3rd female, so it was 3 down, 6 to go. And I remember a few weeks later, I went to Edmonton where I'd been asked to give a speech, and I told the story because I'd been told to say something funny at the beginning of the speech. And much to my surprise, the next day there was an irate letter to the editor in the Edmonton Journal saying, what does this new judge think she's doing? How could she imagine we would have 9 women on the Supreme Court? I bit my tongue, my metaphorical tongue, because I would have loved to have written back, and said, well, the court survived for over 100 years with 9 men and no women, so I think it could survive possibly for a few with all women. But I didn't say that because judges aren't supposed to write back to criticism. But it was a way of showing how women, even then, were regarded in very different light than men.
Yes. Now, you were appointed as Chief Justice by John Chrétien in the year 2000.
Right.
What was your reaction when you got that phone call?
Well, I wasn't totally surprised because the previous Chief Justice had been a Francophone and there was a tradition of alternating, and I was the senior Anglophone on the court at that point. But I was a little surprised. There were other people who were interested in the job, other members of the court, and I certainly didn't think it was a sure thing, and I didn't campaign for it. I thought if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But I was honored. I was deeply honored. That was my reaction, and that I would be considered for that position. And I answered the Prime Minister that I would give the position my very best.
For some who are watching this program, the concept of the Supreme Court of Canada is a distant one. I wonder if you could tell us what the composition of the court is, how many people, the regional requirements, that sort of thing, who qualifies to serve?
Yeah, well, there are 9 people on the court, and there is a tradition, not a constitutional requirement apart from Quebec, that people come from all parts of the country. There have to be, by the Supreme Court Act, 3 people from Quebec to protect the civil code and the civilian way of looking at things. There is a tradition of 1 from the Maritimes, 1 from the West, British Columbia, 1 from the Prairies, 3 from Ontario, and so on. So there is that regional tradition. Canada seems to be a country where institutions have to reflect the regions, and that's true of the Supreme Court as well. So 9 people come together and they hear the cases and decide the cases, and that's the composition of the court.
And how do you decide what cases you're going to hear?
That's done collectively. People file applications for leave, and then the court looks at the applications and takes those that meet the criteria of raising issues of public importance, national importance, that kind of thing. The court leaves to the provincial courts of appeal issues that may be important issues to the parties, but the Supreme Court of Canada is there to basically weigh in on the serious legal issues that on which there may be division across the country, issues that require the answer to be clear from the top, the big legal issues. And at that time, many of those were the big charter issues because it was fairly early days of the charter.
Can you explain to us how decisions are made after you hear the representations from the appellate and respondent? How do you and the other judges go through the process of coming up with a decision?
Well, the first step is we go into the council, into the conference room, and the judges sit around a round table and they discuss the case, usually starting with the junior person and working up. And people give their views, and they're often very lively discussions. And then usually some sort of consensus emerges, not consensus, but indication of where the majority is going to be at least. And so someone volunteers, or the Chief Justice appoints someone to write for the majority. And then someone else will write for the dissent if there is a dissent. There often is not a dissent. And during my early years, it was almost more than 70% of the cases were unanimous.
Right.
So the person goes away who's going to write for the majority or the court and produces a set of reasons, which takes a month or two or whatever. And we have a law clerk, the court has law clerks, each judge has law clerks to help them, etc. They produce a set of reasons which are then circulated to the other judges, and then the other judges, then a period of discussion ensues again, where people discuss different points in the reasons and whether they can agree or not, or whether the wording should be changed so they can agree, and a lot of work gets done at that point. Ultimately, the reasons, when every judge has signed on to at least one set of reasons, the reasons are published.
Now, you often wrote some of the most controversial decisions that your court issued. Was that intentional? And if so, why?
Well, I didn't want to be controversial, so it wasn't intentional in that sense. But my philosophy was that I should call the cases the way I saw them, and not shy from writing if they were just because they were controversial. The reason judges have independence is that they should make the right decision on the facts and the evidence. And so I always tried conscientiously to do that. And then however it came out, it came out. And sometimes I was severely criticized. At least in the short term, although I'm happy to say most of those decisions where I was criticized have survived and have considerable support amongst sectors. But many of the issues that come before the court in the Supreme Court of Canada are very difficult. They're very controversial. They're issues that divide society. And you know that what you write, sometimes in either case, is going to provoke controversy with some group or another. So you have to have the strength of your convictions. You're there to do your best on the facts and the law and do justice. And if some people don't like it, that should not deter you. That was my philosophy.
You've been quoted as saying, "I think the court belongs to the Canadian people and it should reflect the Canadian people." Can you explain what you meant by that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it should reflect on a couple of levels. Ideally, the people should reflect the diversity of Canada. Of course, with 9 people, you can't get representatives from every subgroup, but it should not be a monolithic group. So I'm glad to say there are women now, and increasingly, I think on our courts generally, we find men and women of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. So that is good. That's a physical diversity, a diversity of identity. But there's also a diversity of perspectives that come from bringing 9 people together who come from different backgrounds, different social milieus, different parts of the country. And what you want in a court of final appeal, like the Supreme Court of Canada, is a diverse group of lively intellectual minds, distinguished legal scholars, so that you can bring all those perspectives, different perspectives, to bear on the problem and represent the perspectives of Canada. So that's what you try to do, and that's the ideal situation.
Now, the 9 of you, the 9 judges, would spend a lot of time together and be dealing with challenging issues on almost a daily basis. How do you get along?
Well, I actually, I can only speak during my time, but we got along fairly well, very well. Obviously, you have to maintain your independence and so on, but we were very collegial court, and we had lots of good times together. And as a judge that you are going to have differences on professional differences, legal differences on how you feel about a case with all your colleagues. But that doesn't mean you don't like them, that you don't respect them. And I think it's very important that courts be collegial, because you asked me about how you make decisions. You make decisions by talking about the issues, by sharing ideas, by arguing with each other. And unless you have that foundation of collegiality, conversation, you're not going to do that quite as well as you should. You're going to hesitate before you talk to somebody. You're not going to feel free to say, no, I can't agree with you on that, knowing that it's not going to affect your personal relationship.
There's a perspective that judges are and must be aloof, stick to themselves, not be seen in public, not take opinion, not share opinions on anything. How restricting did you find it to be?
I didn't find it, well, first, not very restricting at all. There are things you don't say and places you don't go, and opinions you don't give out on the street. I mean, you become fairly careful in public pronouncements. And even as Chief Justice, I always weighed what I said very carefully to make sure I didn't tread on political issues, that I didn't say something that would lead a person to think I might have a bias or on something that might come before the court. So you're very careful about how you express yourself. But beyond that, you can have friends outside the court. The old days, the ideal, the typical judge was thought of as someone in an ivory tower, very cloistered, not mingling with other people in society. But that's no longer the rule. I think we understand now that the judges will be better, more effective judges if they actually, to some extent, take part in society. So I as a parent, was involved in many activities with my son. I made acquaintances and friends among people in Ottawa. Obviously, you don't talk about the cases. You're careful what you say, even in those friendships. But no, I found that it was not at all a lonely sort of thing. There are times when it can be, but by and large, I found other interests. I loved music. I still loved reading. And when I came on the court, Justice McIntyre, whom I approached, told me that his most important piece of advice, if he could only tell me one thing, was, he said, find some other interests, otherwise this job will consume you. And that's very true. I mean, there had been people prior to my coming on the court who had been so consumed by the job that they became they were unable to carry on as long as they would have wished, perhaps.
Yes.
And I have always believed that you have to have a rounded life, and that having outside interests were very helpful, and that could be very help you get through the day and get through your weeks and months and get through your cases better.
In addition to your responsibilities as a judge, being first among equals on the court, you have a number of other responsibilities as Chief Justice, administrative responsibilities for the running of the court. You also, along with the other judges, are a deputy of the Governor General of Canada. And that's a role that you were asked to play, to step in the place of the Governor General. That's an interesting story. Can you share that with us briefly?
Well, all of the judges of the Supreme Court, when they are appointed, become deputy governor generals. But if the governor general is unable to perform her functions, then often the Chief Justice it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And in my Chief Justice will be asked to stand in, and in my case, there was a state funeral for former Governor General Raymond Natishan, and Adrian Clarkson, the then Governor General, was, I think, in hospital. So I filled in for that. And the other responsibilities are sometimes you have to sign an order in council or endorse a bill, which is passed by the Parliament and the Senate, and for the Governor General. So it's kind of a backup mechanism.
You actually signed a very significant piece of legislation on behalf of the Governor General.
Yes, I did, and not that I had planned it, but the Parliament had passed and the Senate had approved the Same-Sex Marriage Act, and it was at the time very controversial. And I can't remember all the circumstances, but the Governor General wasn't available, and the other deputy judges who there was nobody else in any event. So I was asked whether I would sign it, and the fact was that a number of people across the country had same-sex couples had already arranged their marriages and things like that, and if the bill wasn't signed, that couldn't go ahead. So normally I would have hesitated to sign a really controversial bill. Even though you wear a different hat, you're the Governor General, something I tried to avoid as a justice. But I felt in this circumstance it was important to get this bill signed, and I seemed to be the only one there, so I did it.
You also had a significant role as the chair of the Canadian Judicial Council. Can you tell us just briefly what that involved?
Well, that's the council of all the Chief Justices of the federally appointed courts across the country and the Chief Justice of Canada. And it's the governing body of judges for purposes of complaints against judges, and also for promoting things like access to justice and better justice across the country.
We will have a number of lawyers watching this program with great interest. We'll also have some people with no interest at all in the specifics of law. But for the former group, I wonder if I could just ask you about if you might just tell us about 2 or 3 of the cases that stick with you, 2 or 3 of the cases that really captured your attention, and perhaps that you were very proud of the role that your court played in deciding.
Well, this was a case that was jointly authored by the court before I was Chief Justice, but the secession reference I thought was a very, very important case. And that was the reference that came a request of the federal government after the very close referendum in Quebec to separate voters were voted. It was a very close vote on whether to secede, and the government asked the court to rule on whether a province could unilaterally secede, and if so, under domestic law and under international law, and if there were different answers, which would prevail. And so it was a very tricky question because the environment was still very heated on the issue, and Quebec didn't even send a person to argue because that time they took the view, the government of Quebec took the view that the court wasn't a legitimate forum for them. But we did have a very good amicus who argued for the province of Quebec and for the case of secession. But it was difficult in the sense there were no precedents. It was difficult in the sense that it was really, really important. It was difficult in the sense that it had political aspects, which courts have to always be very, very careful of. You don't want to you want to stay with the law, not the politics, and you have to always be sure you're not making the political or social situation worse, or somehow having the court act as an agent that will shift things one way or the other. And so it was difficult, but the court, I think, in the end, came up with a very useful decision. It answered no to the questions, but it said that if there were a clear vote on a clear question to secede, then the government of Canada would have to sit down and negotiate. And it outlined fundamental principles like constitutionalism, equality, and federalism, which embed or are there in Canada's underlying Canada's constitution, which would mean we wouldn't go to war and we wouldn't make bellicose statements. We would have to, in that circumstance, sit down and negotiate. And this precedent has become widely read throughout the world on this issue.
I was going to say it had international implications as well as national.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Some of those watching this program will remember a difference of opinion you had with a certain prime minister. I know you've been asked this question a lot, but you can just put that issue to rest if you can just encapsulate quickly for us what that was all about and how it ended.
Well, I was very surprised to wake one morning and find that the headline in the newspaper was that the Prime Minister was accusing me of wrongdoing, and which, of course, if that was true, I would have to step down, and it was a very serious allegation, and one obviously I took and others took very, very seriously. So it's a complicated affair, but basically it had to do with the appointment of filling a vacancy on the Supreme Court of Canada. And this is a situation where the Chief Justice traditionally talks to the Justice Minister and talks with other people, like the Prime Minister and the Justice Minister. There's a consultation that goes on. What's appropriate? How should it be done? This is under the administrative duty of the Chief Justice. And I had telephoned prior to this the Minister of Justice, just to express a concern that had been raised to me about what would happen if someone were appointed from the federal court, which goes back to some wording in the Supreme Court Act that says the person has to have been a judge of the Court of Appeal or a practitioner in Quebec. But without getting into all the legalities, I had contacted the Minister of Justice about a vacancy on the court. It was one brief conversation. I made it clear it was his decision, but I just wanted to alert him to a certain factor. And I wasn't lobbying or anything like that. And then the person was appointed, a person from the federal court was appointed, not anyone I knew at the time was being considered, and we welcomed him. And then the issue did arise, and there was a decision that the person wasn't suited to sit. I know this is very complicated. It's difficult to explain it in 2 words, but basically the Prime Minister's allegation was that through that phone call I had made many months earlier to the Minister of Justice, I had done something wrong, which I knew I hadn't. And so I debated what to do. Normally, one doesn't respond as a judge, but I felt in this case the public at least needed to know the facts. So I issued a statement. I said, I've done nothing wrong. These are the facts. I gave the dates, the conversation, what I've just told you. And I sent it out. And I was very, people could judge. And as it turned out, the International Association of Jurists, the American College of Trial Lawyers, people like that, those groups like that all came out in my support. And ultimately, I think I was vindicated. So it didn't harm me in any way, although it was a rather difficult period to go through.
Sure. Our program is called A Day in the Life. I wonder if you can tell us quickly what a day in the life is like sitting in the Supreme Court of Canada.
Yeah, thank you. I'll pick a day in a sitting week because the court sits 2 weeks and then it retires for 2 weeks to write. So writing is basically going to the office and writing all day and conferring with colleagues, that kind of thing. A sitting week, however, the judge arrives in the morning at the courthouse, does some last minute preparation because the judges all prepare in advance all the cases, maybe talks to law clerks about it. Then you go on the bench, you hear the case. After the case is over, you enter into discussions. If there's any time left in the day, and probably that evening you prepare for the next case, which is the next day. Mm-hmm. And the preparation load is very, very heavy because you have to read all the factums and briefs on the law, and you have to go into the bench really familiar with the issues, the facts, the basis, because the people only have an hour to argue each, and you have to know the case very well, and then you spend that hour having a dialogue with them, asking them questions and trying to clarify points that you might need help on. So sitting weeks are very intense, usually involving long days in which you go back to your desk after dinner and do another couple of hours of work. One of the issues that I know is close to your heart is access to justice. Can you explain to our audience why that's important to you? Well, I think a justice system is there to serve the needs of the people, and it should provide justice to everybody, not just to the rich, not just to those who can afford high-priced lawyers, but to everyone. And we haven't been doing as good a job at this as we should be. Many people find it very difficult to find justice, find a way through their family problems, how to resolve their legal issues with landlords, how to resolve their legal issues on personal injury claims, how to get custody, how to fight for custody of your child when the other parent has it. These issues are very preoccupying to Canadians. Contract issues, maybe you have a dispute with someone who did some work on your house. Can you afford to go to court? How do you get there? What do you do? And we know from statistics such as we have and from anecdotal evidence that we don't do a terrific job on that in Canada. We have a pretty good justice system. It ranks quite high overall worldwide, but it does not rank as high as it should on providing access and this is really important because it's not just a question, of resolving disputes even. It's a question of allowing people to enjoy the rights that the law has given them. And often people can't avail themselves of their rights, or they find themselves pushed into a corner or overlooked or unjustly treated, and they don't know what to do about it. And they can't do anything about it. So it's very, very important to me that we improve access to justice for everyone.
Your Honor, you've had an amazing career. I'm delighted that we're able to share just some highlights of it, because we would be here for many hours to explore all of it. But I do want to mention the remarkable number of honors that you've received. You're a commander of the Legion of Honor, so appointed by the government of France. You're a visitor to Massey College. You're a visitor of Queen's College, Cambridge. And at last count by me, you have 36 honorary degrees. I was wondering if you might share one of those honorary doctorate of laws with us.
I don't know if I'm allowed to, but I'd be very happy to if I could.
You're an author as well as everything else. You wrote a legal thriller called Full Disclosure, which I enjoyed, and on which I wrote to compliment you, because I thought you did a really good job for someone writing their first novel. And you've written a fascinating autobiography called Truth Be Told, and I believe you're the first Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada to write something like that. So I commend you. We are running out of time, so I just want to mention that you are now serving on the court in Hong Kong as a non-permanent member of the Court of Final Appeal in Hong Kong. I'd love to have the opportunity to talk further with you about what lies ahead, but I know we're running out of time. So let me just take a moment, if you will, to thank our viewers for joining us, to thank our Rogers TV staff, to Josh and Elizabeth and Kevin. Thank you so much for the support you give to us, to the Midland Cultural Center, to Eugene and Jared for their support. We want to thank our season sponsors, Kathy Bales and Michelle Bichon of RBC Dominion Securities, and our program sponsors, the Honorable Robert and Mrs. Sharon McKinnon. Your Honor, it has been an absolute delight and a sincere honor for me to meet you, albeit virtually, and I am so grateful to you for giving us the time and for sharing your amazing life with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, and the pleasure is mine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay.